So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the morning session here in This Way Up. My name's Shona Thompson, and I'm a freelance curator and producer, and produce events and projects across Scotland. I'm based in Edinburgh, and welcome to this session about local stories, which is quite a wide-ranging term, I'm sure everyone believes. I'm chair and contributor here today, so I'll be pitching in when as my experience allows me. And I was looking back at the copy for this event, which I had hand in, I have to say, and it was the phrase "local stories for local people." And I don't know if anyone remembers the League of Gentlemen. And it was brought to mind this local stories for local people, which almost has that narrowing ring to it, doesn't it? But it's a lot of our audiences, and we'll be finding out who's in the room. We'll be finding out, what people think already, and we'll be hearing obviously from our distinguished panel. But our audiences are generally local people. They come to their local venue, whether that's a society, a cinema, or a club, and so it's about talking about what are the merits in taking a more direct approach to attracting audiences in, that local audience, into the venue. And it is happening. There's filmmakers and exhibitors as well who are bypassing the central funders and the distributors as well to get to interested audiences through crowdfunding, through production on location, through social media, and even got the regional film hubs is a good example of that work as well. So is it working? Is it having an impact? Where is the industry going with this approach? And what are the challenges? So that's what we're hoping we can try and address today. If it goes another direction, fine. But we're exploring what local means, if anything. Is it important and why? We've had some really excellent PowerPoint displays, which I was feeling quite embarrassed about yesterday. But we don't have PowerPoint, but we've actually got films. So we're going to show a couple of films, not the lights down and everything, and we're going to look at some case studies of films and also events that are operating on some level out with the traditional distribution to connect directly with audiences, and also using more localized marketing methods as well. So I'm delighted to be joined by, from the end there, Andrew Ormston, who's director of Drew Wiley Projects, and then Sally Joynson, who is chief executive of Screen Yorkshire, Virginia Heath, and Grant Keir, who are director and producer of the film From Scotland with Love. We'll be hearing more about these guys shortly, but I wanted to do in time-honoured This Way Up tradition, do a little bit of audience participation, just to warm the room up a little bit. I'm feeling the warmth already, don't worry. So I thought it'd be helpful, though, to find out who's in the room. So it's a bit of a hand-raising exercise, a bit of shouting out where you're from, if you wouldn't mind. So I thought, first off, because we have a couple of filmmakers on the panel, do we have any filmmakers in the room? Yes. Based in Scotland, I know that for a fact. Do we have any funders in the room? Creative Scotland, Film Hub Scotland, Film Hub Scotland. And yourselves? Right?
Film Hub MI.
Ah, perfect. Great. Excellent. Do we have any distributors in the room? Excellent. They bypassed us as well. Great. But no, that's good to know. And exhibitors. We obviously have exhibitors in the room. Do we have bricks and mortar venues? Which venues? Just shout out.
Hyde Park, definitely. Metal at Edge, I think, and then
Oh, yes.
Brewery Arts Centre in Pembroke.
Excellent.
Home.
Home.
The same.
Home.
National Media Museum.
Rural venues in Shropshire.
Shropshire.
Real Hamburg in Keswick.
Lovely. Excellent. Good ranging. Sorry, in the back there.
National Media Museum.
National Media Museum, Bradford. Wonderful. Great. So that's a really nice wide range. In fact, we haven't anybody from London, I don't think, at the moment. So we have community cinema film societies. Shout out who you are. Be great.
Deptford Film Club.
Deptford Film Club. Excellent.
West Side Cinema, Orkney.
Orkney. Yes.
Keswick Film Club and Film Festival.
Keswick, great, yeah.
Sorry, one more thing. Adventures in Alternative Cinema, which is a young people's programme.
Fantastic. Excellent. And yourself?
Cine North, we work in Yorkshire and Cumbria for communities and
Wonderful. Excellent. And then event-based festivals. Oh, excellent. Shout it out.
Cat videos.
Oh, you're a short trailer at this point for going to the cat videos too. Phoenix is going to be brilliant at that. Okay.
Live Cinema UK, we produce and programme live cinema events.
Fantastic. Excellent.
Band of Normal Devices.
Wonderful.
African Motion Film Festival in Scotland.
Great.
Scottish Queer International Film Festival in
Great.
Scotland. Yeah.
Big shout out to the ladies there. We've got Sheffield, is that?
Sheffield Duck Fest.
Nice.
I work freelance at Cine City, Brighton Film Festival, and
Wonderful. Yourself?
Take One Action in Scotland.
An action. Good.
Flat Pack Film Festival. Lost Picture Show and DVD Bang.
Whereabouts is that, sorry?
Lost Picture Show and DVD Bang were both independent, moving, temporarily.
Fantastic. Temporary is good. Temporary is good.
love temporary.
And, yeah,
Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival.
great.
Mental Health Festival in Scotland.
Excellent.
And we host a couple of events which have film very integral to them, which is the Comic Art Festival and the Kendal Mountain Festival.
Excellent, yes. Great. Is that everyone represented?
No, me? No.
No, you are unique in some respects, I suspect, in the room.
I'm from Screen Machine, which is a mobile cinema. It's a truck which opens out into a cinema which tours to 40 remote and rural towns and villages and islands in the Scottish Highlands.
Lovely.
I am based with showroom in Sheffield, but I do run BFI Film Academy and BFI Audience Academy, which was the first one they've done for audience development. And some of our students are up here.
Hey. Excellent. Oh, I'm sure all of our perspective. Oh, and yourself, of course.
Yeah, I'm from Belgium, and I work at the Flemish Film College, and I work on the audience development film culture.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And I'm from Poland, supervising cinema and festival.
Ah, wonderful.
Oh, great.
Wonderful, because I'm glad we all know each other now. That's great, because I do see this event as being, much as we'll have some introductions from our panellists, and more in their introduction, we're sort of talking about their work in terms of the local stories that affect them or don't affect them, and whatever that may happen. But also, it's a two-way thing as well. It's shout out, all that kind of idea. I think we have roving mics, I think, don't we, from lovely Alison over there. So again, in keeping with that this way up community that we're building up, I thought we'd have, as we like to call in Scotland, a wee blether with each other to actually define what local stories actually means to each of us, because it will mean different things. It's it's maybe your Royston Vasey, or maybe it's an audience that you really are looking for or have or want to talk more about. So, person next to you, or in front of you or behind you, do have a quick chat, and if you could have a chat about what do local stories mean to you in your work, that would be great. Just a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean,
So again, I'm just going to go for the shout-out sort of version of communication, because we're in a two-way chat here. Were any results out of that? Because it's really helpful to be able to sort of focus on what we're talking about, what does local stories mean to you?
We just went straight into deconstructing the term local. Yeah. What are we talking geographic? Are we talking community of interest? Can you stretch? How far can you stretch the term? So I don't know if that's really unhelpful, but that's where we went.
No, that's good.
Everyone hear that?
Yeah. Okay.
I think it depends who you are and where you are and what size you are. You know, if you're in a smaller community, local is your audience, and if you're in a bigger place, local becomes about content.
Yeah.
Or can be, you know. So
I'm interested that difference, I think, between, you know, what does it mean to a bigger venue as well as that kind of
Yeah.
smaller.
but then it can also be film community.
Yeah.
So you could become part of a community just by coming to a cinema. It all depends. Yeah, there's a few different things. I think.
There is.
We talked slightly about audiences. We tend to find in Northern Ireland that if you have a local connection or it's about a local theme, audiences will, on average, treble or quadruple. For most of our sort of community cinemas and things like that. But Kendall found a different experience from that.
Yeah, I think we've got slightly, rural areas I think sometimes have a slightly troubled relationship in that the arty side of things, like urban and gritty, and sheep don't have enough edge.
Sheep don't have enough edge.
Someone should tweet that.
Prize me for tweet out for that. That's a great point, though.
It's a great title. Sheep don't
Yes.
have enough edge.
Yeah, no, we were talking about like having like local filmmakers make sort of film stories about, you know, their town and where they're from, being able to like point at screen, being like, oh yeah, I'll wait at that bus stop sometimes, and be able to see like your setting where you live. So then you have that more of a personal connection to the story that's being told.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that personal connection, and yeah, there's the production, or the site-specific kind of production as well.
But we talked, I work in a gallery, which is why I haven't said anything so far, because I don't.
Yeah, you would take that. Yeah, thanks very much.
I work in a gallery, but realised that we do show film, and we're showing stuff for 16 days at the moment. We're doing 16 days of action, and some of it is local groups that have made films. So that for the idea of us of kind of issues that are affecting our community within Glasgow, but also intersect with global issues as well, are often quite pertinent.
Yeah. Great. Yep, and yourself there.
I think I just was listening to everyone else actually just then as well, and thinking that it's really important the contribution that the local or regional stories or narratives from the area outside of the big metro centre, wherever that is in your country. It's important that the contribution that makes to the regional or local culture, and that film does that, because I think it's perhaps something, I don't know, maybe this is not true, but other art forms perhaps make that more successfully, which when perhaps it's harder to see local stories, you know, to go to a cinema and see that and have that contribution made by film culture to the general culture that you have as, you know, a member of the community.
Absolutely, yeah, it comes right out of the building or right out past the screen. Yeah. Oh, that's there.
So yeah, we're the. So I didn't introduce myself earlier, but we're from the Belmont Filmhouse in Aberdeen, and we're sort of council-owned building and sort of council-funded. So we have, I guess, essentially with surrounded by 3 multiplexes, we're a local cinema for local people. We'll have no trouble here, sort of thing, where we have to we sort of support the local filmmakers, and we give them an outlet for actually, one say it, because I mean it's. People say it's awfully difficult. I mean, people say you can make a good film, you can make a bad film, but people actually getting the films made in a place like Aberdeen in the first place to actually then have a venue to actually show the finished product. I think that's very important, and to actually give that outlet to people and support them in sort of becoming filmmakers is something, in from that aspect, the sort of local stories aspect, that's what we can provide that perhaps you wouldn't get elsewhere, and also just showing films and stuff to creating that community feel within the city as well.
Yeah, so it's a platform. Okay, anything else? Oh yes, yourself.
We talked about the importance of where a film was shot. So Skyfall was filmed both in Glencoe and Deptford, so that helped with our ticket sales. And I've heard a rumour that some of the new Star Wars film was shot in the West Highlands, and if that's true, then Christmas will have come early.
Thank you very much, everybody. So, what would be great now is to hear from some of our panel guests as well, and just hear a couple of sort of more detailed kind of case studies, as it were, in terms of this whole realm. And then we'll get on to sort of more of a conversation from the issues we've just been talking about there and what these guys are talking about too. So I'm going to start with Virginia Heath and Grant Keir of Faction North. And Virginia, they both are very experienced filmmakers, made the documentary feature film From Scotland with Love, using only archived footage from the National Library of Scotland Moving Image Archive, with a specially commissioned score by musician King Creosote's Kenny Anderson. It's been screening to a wide range of audiences across the world, and we'll hear more about that. To me, it's been really successful. I believe it's pushing the boundaries of theatrical cinema as well in its subject matter and its distribution strategy. So I'm going to ask Virginia and Grant to tell us a bit about From Scotland with Love in the context of what local stories mean to you. And I must apologise at this point to Kate Taylor, who from the London Film Festival, who did the F-rated session. Yes, I'm completely stealing her idea of asking the panellists to pose questions back to us in their chat. So and also what do these questions, what questions does this idea of local stories raise for yourselves?
Yeah. I suppose the first thing to say, the first thing I always do in a session like this is ask the number of who's seen our film From Scotland with Love. Just put your hand up. So who has not seen it? Okay, so the majority have not seen it. And how many of the people that have seen it first saw it on television? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, one. Okay, that's very interesting.
I never leave the house.
Sorry?
I never leave the house.
You never leave the house. Very wise policy. Just a little bit about this film, because it's an unusual story of how it got commissioned and how it got made, and the how it got made and how it got financed probably also had an impact on how it found its audiences. So the film was commissioned as part of the cultural celebration of the Commonwealth Games that took place in Glasgow in 2014. There was an open fund administered by Creative Scotland, and basically artists of all shapes, sizes, art forms were sort of invited to pitch in ideas that would respond to the Commonwealth Games and the cultural celebration of the Games being in Glasgow. So we pitched in an archive in music film that would be using purely Scottish archive from the Moving Image Archive. It wasn't called that then, but it's what it's called now. And we got a major award from that fund of £300,000. We then were able to take that proposition to BBC Scotland as our broadcast partner because we needed more money to make the film. They put in £120,000 for a licence, so they're not an equity owner of the film. And then we did a deal with the National Library of Scotland's archive, whereby they invested a notional amount of money against the rights that they controlled and owned in the archive. So the great thing about that, and Virginia's going to talk about this, so I won't say much about it, but it meant that it was an artistic commission. It wasn't a traditional kind of, there's a television commissioner looking over one shoulder, telling you what to do and what not to do. When we finally put all the bits of money together and we sort of said to the funders, okay, well, what are we going to make now? They said, well, it's up to you. You can do whatever you like, basically. And I think, as Virginia will tell you, this is like, my God, this is manna from heaven. I mean, you never get that opportunity. What that meant in terms of the distribution of the film is that the first exhibition of the film had to be a public event to celebrate the Games. So this film actually exists in different medium. It exists on different platforms, and that was built into its DNA. So it's a film that can be screened in cinemas. It's an LP released by Domino Records, completely standalone soundtrack. It's also available on download. I'll come back to why that was significant in a minute. It's a live musical performance of the film, played in synchronization with the film. And it also exists as a DVD, and you can buy it online as a download from iTunes. So the very first public performance was a live musical performance in a field in Glasgow, and it rained. Heavily.
You joke.
But actually, it was an amazing experience because it was a largely, I would say, a largely Glaswegian audience.
Well, it was during the it was during the Commonwealth Games, so there was a huge number of people visiting Glasgow. But it was just so moving how staunch people were, because it's 75 minutes long, and we kept thinking, oh, it's just going to rain for a bit and then clear up. But no, it rained for the whole thing, and people just had their hoodies and their. I remember Colin Money, the editor, just stood there with his long grey hair kind of streaming with water, and you just, as a sort of watching from beginning to end. And we just got the most fantastic response from the audience. It was really, really.
Yeah. So basically, the band were on a stage covered, and the screen was at the back. It was during the day, so it wasn't particularly dark, other than the clouds. And it was the very first time we'd really threw it out to the audience to see what they made of it. Now, in a sense, you could say that made, From Scotland with Love screened in Glasgow during the Commonwealth Games. That's a very local audience. I mean, probably there's quite a lot of international guests as well, because a lot of people came to the games. But it felt like a very local audience. And I really remember that moment where, because you never know how an audience is going to respond until they actually tell you. And there was just this incredible roar that went up from the audience at the end of the film. And it still gives me the goosebumps, and I cry. It's like, so at that point, I knew we had something, and then so that was the first time it was played in public, and then the next outing of the film was on BBC Two Scotland. So it's BBC Two, which is good because that's a kind of mainstream audience, but it's BBC Two Scotland, so this is an opt-out from the national network. And it rated extraordinarily well. So they immediately scheduled another screening. So it was on BBC Two Scotland twice, and then BBC Four down in London sort of said, oh, this sounds interesting, it's getting very good audiences, maybe we'll put it on BBC Four. So they put it on BBC Four. That was the good news. They said, oh, good news is we're going to screen it on BBC Four. It's up against the World Cup final. But again, it found a really, really dedicated audience. And the other first for me was, and I'll stop here because I want to blather on, it was the first film I'd made which went out on television in the age of Twitter. And that was an extraordinary experience. We had one of our team in the company who's a Twitter expert and can just tweet really fast, just fielding thousands and thousands of tweets that were coming in from the television viewing. One in particular, I remember, this guy was like, this is terrible. And we're like, oh no. I can't go to bed. I'm completely riveted to this film. I've got to see it through to the end. So it was an extraordinary kind of way of finding your audience. And just those experiences made us feel like we had a real proposition. And so we then basically looked at, okay, the film has gone out, it's gone out in these different forms. Can we get it into cinemas? And of course the first thing that came up, the objection, it's been on television. But this was where Film Hub Scotland rode to the rescue and said, well, we will put some money up to help get this film out into cinema. So they took some of the financial risk away from the exhibitors, including our friends in Aberdeen, GFT, Film House, right round Scotland, basically. All the art house cinemas took the film. And it sold out every single screening, more or less, everywhere we went. And every time we had an audience, we said to them, who has watched this film already on television? And almost everyone put their hand up. And that was interesting because what that made us understand was for certain types of film, where you're offering the audience a real access to a story that is relating to them and that they care about, and it's a cinematic experience. I mean, these archive films with music, they sort of, they invite you into this kind of slightly hypnotic world, and you just lose yourself for an hour and a half or whatever. And, we had a fantastic series of screenings in the art house cinemas. So I think that, what that proved was that you can overcome the natural reticence of exhibitors and distributors to sort of be, a bit worried about risk if you've got a little bit of money that just helps take the edge off that. So that was my sort of feeling very strongly that was important.
Yeah, and we were just, somebody mentioned there about local and regional stories and how that can spill out of the cinema into the community and into our society. Virginia, did you feel a responsibility heavy on you that you're representing Scotland and Archive? There's a lot of films in there. You know, how did you approach that as an artefact that you knew?
It was a huge responsibility because I live in Scotland now in Edinburgh, but actually I'm from New Zealand, so I'm sort of an outsider. So I was making this landmark film about Scotland in a year that was a landmark year because there was the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, but then obviously the referendum following on from that. And I knew that it was an incredibly important moment in Scottish history. And to a certain extent, it is a kind of historical film, although I think a very new approach to history. And we made a certain number of decisions. So, I mean, it was a local film if you, in the sense of appealing to a very distinct community, which is a nation, obviously.
Yes.
But what does that mean in the context of that film? I mean, you still have to make decisions about, you know, how are you going to represent this nation? And for me, and also King Creosote music team, for everybody involved in the film, we were very clear that we wanted to make a people's history, a history from below. As a female woman film director, I really wanted to bring out women's stories. When we researched the archive, I was working with a young woman researcher, and we were just absolutely dedicated to find interesting archive of women wherever we could, and I think that's a very strong thread in the film. We had sort of an overall theme of love and loss, which sort of resonated through the whole film. And we approached the film telling this reflection on 20th century Scotland history. We approached that thematically. We didn't want to do a chronological approach, and we mixed up archive from different decades according to the theme that it went with. And I think people have responded to that really well. So it was, you know, even it was a national, local, I suppose, but very national story. But we still had to make very strong choices about what, you know, how we were going to represent that story in terms of, you know, what communities, and it was very much, I think what people have loved about the film is that it does have a very strong sense of place and sense of people rooted in the community, people sort of acting in a communal way. There's a real sense of community spirit. You know, I think that's really one of the strengths of the film. But, you know, in terms of coming back to what does local stories mean, I mean, for me, I don't see From Scotland with Love as a local film in that sense, because although it's got, you know, it's very strongly rooted in Scotland, I always wanted it to have universal themes, and I wanted it to be able to travel, because I wanted people outside of Scotland to be able to experience this local story and relate to it. So for me, you know, my question to the audience, I suppose, would be, how do you make local stories universal, or not necessarily universal, but of appeal to, you know, because if you've got a great local story to tell, you don't want to just tell it to local people necessarily. You want it to be able to travel and to speak to people outside of your own sort of borders. And I mean, we were in the New Zealand Film Festival. It's a fantastic festival because it actually takes your film and it tours it around the whole country. So you get multiple screenings of your film, and obviously there's a big Scottish diaspora in New Zealand. We got a fantastic response from audiences there, older people who were just transported back to the country that they'd left, and sort of memories and so forth, and young people who are like, oh, thank you, and now I understand what my grand's been banging on about to me, you know, about the stair and the, you know, all those sort of...
Great. Well, I think we've got a clip of the film, so I think we're going to show a wee clip of the film.
beside my only brother. My coffin shall be black, 6 white angels at my back, 2 to sing, 2 to pray, 2 to carry my soul away. A ding-dong was the castle bell, so fear thee well, my mother. Bury me in the old churchyard, beside my only brother. My coffin shall be black, 6 white angels at my back, 2 to sing, 2 to pray, 2 to carry my soul away.
Way down upon the Swanee River, where I sail in splash, that's where the alligators singing. Britannia, your man is making jam, German sausages.
Great, thank you. So I'm sure there'll be questions, more questions, but we're light in the room. But I'm going to move on to Sally Joynson. Thanks very much, guys, and we'll move to Sally Joynson. And Sally is Chief Executive of Screen Yorkshire. And Screen Yorkshire was formerly, and Sally, just correct me if I've got this incorrect, but I took it off the website, so I think it's formerly part of the UK network of screen agencies. And the network closed in 2011. And then it was relaunched as a private business specialising in commercial content investment in film, television and games. And Screen Yorkshire has invested in productions such as Berberian Sound Studio, and also television such as Peaky Blinders, and also through the Yorkshire Content Fund of X and Y, I believe was part of that. So I wanted to ask Sally just to tell us about the work of Screen Yorkshire through initiatives like the Yorkshire Content Fund, the context of what local stories means to you, and any questions that raises for yourself.
Okay, well, you would think that running an organisation called Screen Yorkshire, that localism and local stories would be absolutely fundamental to what we do. And for the first 10 years of our life, when we were a regional screen agency, local, or let's call it regional was absolutely what we did. And we invested and supported local talent and local writers. We invested in content that was culturally significant to our region. And that was very much our raison d'etre for the first 10 years. So during those years, you'll have seen us support projects like Red Riding Trilogy, which we did with Channel 4, which then went on to theatrical release in the US. We did projects like The Damned United, Brian Clough's 44-day tenure at Leeds United, very ill-fated. So we did a lot of films that were culturally significant, but not necessarily always commercially successful. And that was fine, because the way that we ran at that time was very much about supporting a film culture and film industry in Yorkshire. So fast forward to 2010 and 2011, and there were huge changes for all the screen agencies in those years. And Creative England was set up as a single agency for Out of London, and most of the screen agencies either closed completely, put their assets into Creative England, but Screen Yorkshire stayed in business, and we went from being an agency which for the first 10 years of our lives we had been completely publicly supported. Didn't have to earn much of our own money at all. And in 2011 the world changed very significantly for us, and we literally jumped from the public sector into the private sector. We are a small, there's only 7 of us,
local business, and we run a very large European fund which invests, it part finances film, television and games. And the reality now is that the local aspect is not about local stories or local writers, it's about getting that content made in Yorkshire, filmed in Yorkshire, and that will either be in whole or in part. Some of those productions will come out of local companies like Warp Films. Some of them will be written by local writers like Gwyneth Hughes, Sally Wainwright, Kay Mellor. Some of them will feature Yorkshire as Yorkshire, so something like Catch Me Daddy, very much set in Yorkshire. And other films that we support will have no relevance to Yorkshire other than they have been part financed and part filmed in Yorkshire. So something like The Hunter's Prayer that comes out in 2016, shot extensively in Harrogate, and Harrogate was in fact doubling for Switzerland. So, the definition of local has changed very significantly by necessity. Okay, we had to change our business model very, very substantially, and it was a massive cultural shock, I'd have to tell you, for those of us that were left, going from supporting things that you wanted to support because they were about Yorkshire or they were culturally significant. That does not count anymore. We invest in order to recoup our investment, so the first thing that we would look for is whether or not this project that's come to us has commercial appeal, and whether in investing we can get our money back, because we are no longer judged on those old screen agency outputs of, you know, jobs created, cultural films, number of new talent you were developing. We are now measured on our ability to recoup. So you can understand that our business model and what we look for has changed substantially. So local for Screen Yorkshire now is about getting it made in Yorkshire, getting Yorkshire crew on it, getting trainees onto it, opening up opportunities for Yorkshire talent by bringing these productions in, and it will be a mix of incoming and homegrown.
And do you have, I suppose, the connection with exhibitors in terms of, do you have like a kind of long-term view of that value of your exhibitors locally and the content?
Well, most of the films that we work on now are fairly substantial budgets attached to them, and they will have commercial appeal, and so a lot of the work on with exhibitors and distribution, if I give you an example, last year we did Dad's Army, so the new feature film remake of Dad's Army set in the fictional Wilmington-on-Sea. The feature film actually shot in Bridlington, Scarborough and Beverley, so right along the east coast of Yorkshire, which now doubles for Wilmington-on-Sea. There has been so much buzz around that film that I think Universal were quite amazed. I think everybody was amazed at how much interest people took in it. Now, as that goes into cinemas next February, all the focus, and we've been working closely with Universal and Freud's on this, all the focus on that is about the national press. It's about national coverage, but where we have been working more closely locally is we know that there is a massive audience locally for that film because it was filmed here. When it was shooting in Bridlington and the first shots went out, which were actually not official shots, I think they were just kind of shots that people had put online, hotel bookings in Bridlington went up 69% overnight. So people were flocking to Bridlington to actually see this film being shot. So Bridlington, all of the east coast of Scarborough now is gearing itself up in various ways to take advantage of that film when it comes out. Now, from Freud's point of view as the publicist, I think realistically it has been the intervention of Screen Yorkshire that has made them look very seriously at the local and regional aspect of the work. Because most of the time, the local aspect is not something that is uppermost in people's minds. So we've really had to kind of push ourselves in there, and it's working quite effectively. So what I'd say in terms of local exhibitors is that where you have films that are made locally, there is a real trick not to miss in engaging with your potential audience by pressing the locally filmed button. We know from all the work that we do that if it is filmed in Yorkshire, Yorkshire audiences actually think it's a bit more special. And I'll give you an example of a man who I've never met in my life who contacted me just after we launched the fund and said, I think this is great. I want you to tell me about everything that you're investing in. So, but actually he's very good because he emails me regularly and he says, what's the next thing coming out? What's the next thing on TV? What's the next thing on film? I've got my list of these things. This man, who I've never met, lives in Cambridge. He comes from Yorkshire, but not for about 20 years as he set foot in Yorkshire by the sounds of it. And he goes to see almost everything that we have financed in the cinema and on TV because it's filmed in Yorkshire. So I think you can sort of draw your own conclusions from that. I'm not saying that it's the single biggest factor in attracting an audience, but I do think from everything that we've done that where exhibitors actually play on those local connections, then it's of interest to your audience.
Okay, thank you. And we have a showreel of your...
Yeah. This showreel, just to tell you, it was actually done as a retrospective of Screen Yorkshire's life. So there's things in there that relate to Screen Yorkshire as a screen agency, and then it comes up to date.
Great, thank you.
Dream big.
Yes.
Okay, so the slight glitches there. So, I'd like to move on now to Andrew Ormston, and then we'll get right into the last half hour of proper chit chat, two-way chat going. So Andrew has a wide and varied career working across Europe with governments, agencies, cities, arts organisations, creative businesses and higher education. And directed a number of festivals and venues prior to leading cultural services in Birmingham and in London as part of Birmingham's establishing Film Birmingham. And is a board member of Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival. And I should say that we're also working together on an audience development project called Sensing Place. Tell us a bit more about that, but can you tell us what local stories means to you, Andrew, and what questions this raises for yourself?
All right. I don't have a clip, and I did offer to tap dance, but nobody...
If there's time at the end, we can do that.
All right, okay, good. Well, I found a new word yesterday, actually. I'm probably the only person in the whole room that didn't know it. Hyperlocal. And I thought it sounded like a behavioural problem, but I think that's what I'm talking about, really. And this sort of story starts, maybe 2 years ago, the Scottish Film Summit event, which I went to, and there was a panel, and in fact Melanie from Sheffield was on the panel, I think, and it was the BFI, a very nice man who I think runs the archives bit of the BFI, did a really nice presentation about what an amazing impact they'd had using screening archive material in big outdoor event settings at the British Museum in London, and how this had absolutely transformed the audience. They got a depth and a breadth of audience that they just wouldn't ever normally get. And I was thinking, well, yeah, but that's like the British Museum in the centre of London, and it's like all these resources and everything. So what about the rest of us? You know, sort of how can we do this? And how can we make things like Britain on Film kind of connect for everybody else? Because, yeah, we know that works. We know this sort of stuff gives breadth to our audience, and we'd like to do it as well. Thanks very much. So that sort of led to a number of sort of discussions, really. And then in fact, Melanie, I think, was part of those discussions. And then I found myself at a film audiences conference in Edinburgh. And Shona was there, and Screen Machine were there. And it was a sort of another panel. And I was doing my usual rant, which is basically, has anybody read Saskia Sassen's book? Anybody know a book called Expulsion? She basically argues that the way society is now and everything is that we're not just marginalizing people, we're excluding them from society because they can't afford to be in it and whatever. And I think there's quite a strong argument that we're also doing a bit of that with culture, that we're actually expelling people from culture because they can't afford to engage with it, they can't got the transport to get to it, all of those sorts of things. So so I did this usual rant, but afterwards we all sort of got together and we're talking about the kind of different work we did, and we had the Fantasy Film Project, which was Fantasy Film Project was Screen Machine based, and the idea was that we would actually have an international festival of screen machines, and a bit like a sort of John Wayne Western where all the wagons circle, you know. We would actually get all of these mobile cinemas from around the world together, and they would like get together and be like a John Wayne Western, have a circle, and presumably fight off London centrism or something. And but actually, we did start to get a bit serious. That led to a number of discussions. And I think to the credit to Regional Screen Scotland and Film Hub Scotland, they sort of encouraged this. We sort of met in their offices and sort of they helped us to develop these ideas about what could we do, what interventions could we make to connect up better the areas of Scotland in particular that don't have much infrastructure, that actually don't really have very developed cultural organizations in our area. And what could we do to actually make life easier for local promoters and community organizations to connect to the mainstream, whether it's a Britain on Film program or whether it's something coming out of film hubs, whatever. So we sort of developed that a bit further, and then we got into this very interesting area of screen archives. Now, what Shona and I have got in common a bit is I've been kicking around Berwick Film Festival quite a long time, as Melanie will say, probably with a pained expression. And obviously Shona's got Bowness behind her, and so what we know is that local screen archive material is incredibly powerful. As many of you will know, that you actually do a program that's got some local connection through screen archives, and you get not only a lot of people, but you actually get different kinds of people coming to that. So we thought, well, that's a very powerful thing, and we wanted to play with that. We then had a very good discussion with the Scottish Storytelling Centre. And I don't know if you know, but like I just finished doing a review of the literature sector in Scotland, and storytelling in Scotland is amazing. It's sort of been this amazing renaissance of storytelling, where there's like loads of professional storytellers, there's loads of storytelling festivals, and it just has real kind of power and reach across the whole country now. And the director there, Donald, said, first thing he said was, actually this is brilliant because cinema and storytelling have got this really big connect. Like we've got a much bigger connect with cinema than we do with literature. And you know, there's a lot that we can do with that. And storytellers working with cinema has got real potential. So we kind of took that and added that into the mix as well. And then I went off to yet another bloody conference. And this time I was leading a working group in Europe, in exotic places like Florence and things. And it was a Voice of Europe working group. And it was about how you connect, it was called Participatory Governance of Intangible Cultural Heritage.
Local stories for this one.
Sort of rolls off the tongue, that, doesn't it, really? But what it was kind of interesting, and what it meant was, how do we get people involved with intangible cultural heritage, i.e. stuff that's not buildings, in a way that they're co-creating, kind of involved, not just the people at the end of the chain experiencing barriers, but people actually helping to do it. So I led this working group and then had to discuss this in Brussels with a bunch of senior policy museums people and arts people from around Europe, who my working group had said, yeah, you know, let's get participation, co-creation, let's get people into boards, let's get all of this happening. And they were all going, no. We have to look after our culture, and you know, we have to curate, and we have to kind of do it. So, so that came into play with this project, and Shona and I were very keen to explore co-creation and how we actually work with communities in a relationship throughout the whole process, not just removing barriers to them attending an event. So that was the kind of third plank that where we got to. And I should say something about Berwick Film Festival, actually, because just in case people don't know about it. This is my advert in the middle. Does everybody know about Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival? A lot of people do, I think. Yeah, good. Well, quite a lot of you. So I'll not spend long on it. I mean, just to say that it sort of is quite extraordinary because it's a festival that is really well placed because it actually commissions work into site-specific locations around the whole fabric of the town. So you can go into like an old ancient ice house buried in a city wall and have some actually quite cutting-edge film installation that sort of, the last one actually felt like I was on an acid trip, actually. It took me right back to about 1971. And so it's quite interesting, and it's a film festival, and you can go and sit in cinemas and like watch film all of the time, but it's actually also something right embedded into the whole kind of place. So it's a very interesting event, and I recommend it. It's in mid-September. So moving on from that, we kept developing this and then had further discussions, and then we had this funny moment, because it was like, well, here we have a project that's got storytelling working together with cinema people, storytellers and cinema people working together in local communities to create work and to create activity and to connect that to the kind of wider mainstream. But then we had this awful moment, well, what does that actually mean? Like, what does it look like? You know, what is that kind of thing? And we both had different sort of things that helped us along that. Mine was actually, I happened to be up late at night watching on video Blue in the Face. Has anybody seen Blue in the Face? Has anybody seen Smoke?
Yeah.
Well, they did a sequel. I don't know if this story's true, but this is the way it is, that when they did Smoke, which you know is Harvey Keitel in a cigar shop in Brooklyn, just with like people coming through the door and just having Brooklyn conversations and all that sort of stuff. And it had a fairly stellar cast in a way, but when they finished doing it, because everybody was so kind of geared into it, they shot it like really early, they finished really early and only used like half the budget or something, so they decided they'd just keep going. And what they did is they rang up all their pals that lived in Brooklyn and asked them to come down and have like what my kids would call a spraff, you know, just like a discussion in the cigar shop and do their thing. And so that kind of, it became this amazing movie where, all right, these people were like Madonna and Roseanne, that kind of people. Their pals are not my kind of pals, but it did have that really strong sense of place, that really strong sense of shared stuff, and that really strong sense of storytelling. And I thought, we can do things here that actually are magic to be involved with and to put in a cinema and whatever. That can still be entirely about a very local sort of set of relationships. So that was my kind of moment. So where we've sort of got to now is we do have Sensing Place on the Stops, and it's grown from just like a specific project that was going to be about one thing. And that one thing was actually, we decided on an area of Scotland, which is 3 adjacent areas, the Borders, Dumfries and Galloway, and East Ayrshire. And we decided on those because particularly the Borders really does struggle in terms of practical things. It's got really bad youth unemployment, it's got crap transport, spatial strategy to do anything about it is really difficult, it's so big and dispersed. And so this was an area that we were very keen to see if we could make an impact in. And of course Alchemy Film Festival is there, and we made a partnership with them. And we decided we'd use 3 adjacent areas because then we could actually use the same pairings of film artists or film people and storytellers to work across the 3 areas with local promoters. And then we did like jaunts. We went out there and we drove around and met local festivals, local promoters, local community groups, and sort of got local traction and enthusiasm going for it. But actually, so we have a sort of project, and the project is going to sort of pilot next year. But we also have something more than that. We sort of realized that we've got this model that loads of other people are interested in. So we are beginning to have much wider discussions about how this kind of approach might apply in other situations. So like, they shall be nameless, but a big national kind of heritage-based festival planned for 2017, we've had a discussion with them because they're thinking, how do we actually connect to the communities in this area that we're doing this mega event in? And they're kind of interested, and also how do we put in film? Because we know film gets the audience we want, just like an art house audience. So we're sort of talking to them. So it's got very, very interesting. And our ambition is, I mean, big this in Scotland, the Geddes quote about, think global, act local, is very much part of this, and that we do see it as something that we want to collaborate into Europe and internationally as well as throughout the UK. So I'm going to shut up there other than one thing, which is, I was very struck this morning about the comment at the introduction that big events yesterday, changing all of our lives a bit. And I just wanted to say that, I think the way we should be thinking, connecting around Syria and those issues is connecting with our peers in Syria and those places. And I don't know if and to start the ball rolling on that, I think Shona knows this, but there's a documentary collective in Syria and Damascus called abunadra.com, who do amazing short documentaries and films about the lives of local people in Syria. And they've actually also done a kind of curated selection of these around that tells the story of what's led to the current situation and people's experience of that. So, there are ways of actually connecting to our peers in places like Syria, and I just would encourage people to do that. I think it's it's probably the best thing we can do in this kind of moment we find ourselves in. Sorry, what should I say?
Heard a lot of talk there, really interesting, 3 very different studies there. So has anyone got any questions?
Just interested in terms of what's been coming out there. What about what it might be that as audiences people are what psychological fix people are getting when they are seeing and enjoying content that is quote unquote local, their streets, whatever. I can walk out of my front door and see my street anytime. What psychological fix am I getting? We all know that this is true, that audiences are really hungry for this stuff, but why? And is it replicable, with other kinds of content? Or
I'll do a very quick one because I've got a lot more to say. But my thing is that it's because it's a social and shared experience. So I think when you're sat in the cinema watching this stuff happening, it feels like a social and shared experience, and it has extra power for that. But
I mean, Grant was talking about the initial tour that we did of Art House Cinemas with support from Film Hub Scotland, but then they supported us to do an extra tour going to much more remote places. And an example of one of the interactions that we had was on Sky, and we basically had a screening in what was a sports hall. And in advance of the screening, a local school teacher who was part of the sort of panel of people bringing the film there, had got the school children to interview their grandparents and write down stories that their grandparents had told them, get family photographs and so forth, which were all put up on walls around the hall, and bring in artifacts of interest that they'd got from their families and grandparents. The whole evening was, I mean, we didn't have a screening that had anywhere else that had such a wide range from people sort of from about 5 years old to 80. The whole thing was an incredible community event, and it wasn't just about the film, it was about, I suppose, what the film had provoked people to feel about their own heritage in Scottish heritage, and wanting to express that. And you know, that was a really moving and exciting evening. It was really such a great thing to be part of, you know. And so those sort of smaller community screenings that we've done of the film, where people have really kind of not just come along and watched it, but actually sort of organised events around it. It's not events we organise, events that people organise for themselves. That's been really, really a great part of touring the film.
So at the end, yeah, the thing is that they used the film to meet each other. You know, I mean, that was not entirely immediately obvious to us, because obviously we're coming in from the outside and descending into that community, and there they are already formed, 150 of them. And we think, oh, you obviously all know each other, and they're like, no. This is how we are getting to know each other. So the film was a catalyst to allow them to do something as well as watch the film. You know, they were making food. There was tombolas. It was extraordinary experience, actually, wonderful.
And I can imagine there's people in the room who've actually done that as well, and I think that's an important point to make too. And I've got another question over there.
I just wanted to ask whether, and this might be a little bit of a spiky question, I don't mean to be that, but whether or not a lot of these projects are bordering on nostalgia and are about making people feel comfortable about their stories and their lives, which is not a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I wonder if there's a place for local stories that challenge and actually tell an uncomfortable story about your area or your region or internationally.
Okay, I think Sally and Andrew put some to say on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Several years ago in Screen Agency days, if we invested in something that gave a really harsh view of a local community or a local place, we really got it in the neck. There was one glorious headline when we were doing Red Riding, and it was in, I think, something like the Yorkshire Post, and it said, the chiefs at the Yorkshire Tourist Board must have their heads in their hands this morning following last night's screening of Red Riding, because it was incredibly gritty. Now, I think, fortunately, the world has moved on now, and I think people are much more comfortable with seeing their towns, their cities, their culture on screen in a way that is not necessarily that attractive. And I think you only have to look at, I mean, I know it's TV, but something like Happy Valley. Happy Valley is absolutely not about a happy valley. I mean, it's about people being bludgeoned in cellars. But actually, you know, 8 years ago, the local community would not necessarily want to be associated with that production. Whereas now, irrespective of the subject matter, it's a wide generalisation, people do enjoy, I suppose, being associated with it. In terms of nostalgia, we used to do loads and loads of work. We ran with BFI and Film Council a project called Screen Heritage UK, so we did loads of work on archive. And I mean, the time we started this film, I had never come across an element of film that was so undervalued and so hidden as Film Archive was a good number of years ago. It is the most fantastic resource, and everything that we've seen on your film and what you've been talking about, Andrew. We have done local screenings on Archive several times over, and the audiences are phenomenal. And what is it? Is it nostalgia? I think that's part of it. The previous question, what is it that you get physiologically through it? I think it's a sense of recognition, a sense of your place in the world, a reflection of your culture, and an enormous sense of pride. So I think there's a lot of things mixed up in there.
But I'd also say, I mean, in terms of From Scotland with Love, we were very conscious that we wanted to put in footage of, particularly celebrate the way in which people throughout the 20th century went out and fought for their rights and so forth. I mean, there's a shot of when the tanks came to were in George Square during the general strike, and I think it's really, that was one of the intentions, to provoke people to think about, if you want things to change, you have to get out and fight for it, and there's a lot of things that valuable things there that have been lost, and in that sense it's a kind of provocation, I think, for our lives today, how have we moved on, and all the fantastic things that have improved, like women having washing machines and not having to wash their clothes in the street. But on the other hand, what have we've maybe lost that sense that we've got to go out and absolutely fight for what we believe in, and really make changes in our lives and so forth. So I think it's a dual thing.
Yeah, great, thanks. Andrew.
I just want to say, I think there's two areas of discomfort, sort of being spiky and not being nostalgic and not being kind of, nicey, lovey-dovey, is quite an interesting one, because I think it is actually quite a big issue around artistic freedom and artistic responsibility, which we tend to talk about in big global terms, but actually when you're working at local level, it's there with you the whole time. And in Berwick, we have this, we've just had a debate around this actually, because we have some fairly spiky programming in it, and we have some fairly intense art house programming it, to the point that you just think, whoa, this is all so rarefied, I'm now losing my kind of feet on the ground on the planet. And we have a real kind of interesting balance and tension, actually a real balance is not right, tension between our local relationships to sponsors, to local people, to our volunteers, all of those kind of people, and to the fact that we've got really quite in-your-face, cutting-edge stuff happening out there. And it's something we have to really take care of, because you can't just write it off saying it's artistic freedom, man. It's something you have to manage and work at and be aware of your responsibilities around. And in fact, we're just about to have an away day to discuss that very topic all day, so wish us luck. I just want to say the other area of discomfort, though, is I think a discomfort for us, which is around this issue about what is culture, because there's this very simple thing that actually if you want to increase the amount of people and the breadth of people that engage with your culture, you have to change what your culture is. It's not a barrierless thing. And we've had this debate in Heritage, and in Scotland Museums Galleries Scotland, if you go online, you see they have something which is inviting communities and people to nominate what culture is and what they should be looking after and dealing with. That's radical. But they're saying that's the only way of actually really widening our audience and widening our engagement. And I think that applies to all art forms and all cultural practice.
Just a couple of observations. Rick Shaw from BFI. But for those who haven't seen it, I urge you to go and have a look at the map for Britain on Film, which is a sort of extraordinary and growing thing, which has had an adoption far beyond our expectations. In fact, I've just had an email from the digital director this morning of BFI telling me that his budgets are bust because of the amount of video views that we've offered up. The latest count, 6 million people have viewed that content, which is a huge project and will only grow. And I don't think that it's mutually exclusive. It is a very heritage-based project. It allows you to search down to your local street level for films made in the 20th century across the entire UK, and by the time it's finished it'll be well in excess of 10,000 bits of content. But when we knew we had this content, perhaps I didn't quite know what I was doing, but I did ask somebody to come along and swim in this archive with no restrictions at all. Her name was Penny Woolcock, and you know, a filmmaker from a huge admiration. And she came back 10 weeks later with a film that really shocked me. It sort of rocked my world. It was a very dramatic polemic on actually social housing and housing issues across it. It hasn't seen the light of day yet, but it will in January. It is sufficiently provocative to make it onto Channel 4, and I don't think that heritage and archive material is mutually exclusive from people taking a very clear and provocative look at contemporary issues. And I hope when you see Penny's short, which is called Out of the Rubble, you might agree that archive has huge power to be able to deliver today. So I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, and nor do I think the local stories they've presented are anything other than compelling for a local audience.
I wanted to firstly just make a quick sort of call to action really for exhibitors about local stories, because if something isn't being filmed by you, back around your, wherever your cinema or festival is, you can still find stories within it. I mean, recently I produced an event called Suffragette Live, which was part of the Times Now series. And we actually did a promenade protest in costume as suffragettes through Huddersfield. And I really wanted to do something in Huddersfield, in my hometown. Suffragette wasn't filmed anywhere near Huddersfield, but a tiny bit of research uncovered many prominent speeches that were made by Emily Pankhurst and various other high-profile suffragettes. So I'd really encourage exhibitors to look a bit deeper into films that you want to show and what local links historically could be there. But also, I wanted to ask a question about how aware do you think production companies are when they're first making a film about the impact they can have and how much more popular a film could possibly be if they have a strong local collection, local connection like with Dad's Army. Is it something that's brought up on the agenda by funders, like you could have a really big regional premiere instead of a London premiere? Is that something that's being told to production companies?
I think Dad's Army is a really interesting case in point. There is no way that we could get a regional premiere of Dad's Army to compete with the London premiere. The focus will always be on the London premiere, no matter how much of a fuss we kick up about it. The focus will always be on London. But with Dad's Army, so was the production company aware of the local impact? Absolutely not. So they started filming and the word got out, and Screen Yorkshire was almost under siege from emails, phone calls, any means of communication from people in the region wanting to know how they could get involved, people wanting to be an extra, you name it, we had it. And the phones never stopped. And the filmmakers had no idea that this was going to happen. So I think they thought that obviously Dad's Army was a popular brand, but they really underestimated what was going to happen locally. And honestly, it was like the floodgates were open. Now I think probably through our own experience, we at Screen Yorkshire, and I'm looking at Rachel here, who's as well as running Cine North, who's also my comms manager, we are better at predicting what is going to happen locally when we have a film in. We did a Royal Night Out in Hull. We had 1,500 people working on that as extras. So huge local interest in that film. There was a local screening of it, which was done by colleagues at Hull Independent Film. They had no idea that Screen Yorkshire had invested in it. Okay, so I think it's an imperfect work. I think what you have to do, everybody involved in this, everybody has to work very hard at asserting the local connection. So I absolutely take your point about Huddersfield and Suffragette. If you dig deep, you'll very frequently find a local connection. It's not a problem for us, for films that we've part financed, for us to go and attend screenings. And we've done lots of this stuff. With City Screen in York, we did Bill and X+Y, and we did X+Y for a very specialist audience there. We did something with children's services in Leeds with Get Santa. So I think there is a willingness for more and more for people to engage. Everybody wants bums on seats for these films. So I think people do actually start to get that actually there are some things that you can do regionally which will help boost that film. If you look at a film called I Am Nazreen in the Northeast, which Tyneside Cinema really heavily backed and promoted, and they did a special screening of that film. And it went down so well that they then had to do another 4 screenings of it, and this was all done because the director and the crew were working really hard locally to build that audience, and it went bigger and bigger and bigger, and I'm sure you know the story. It ended up 16 different screenings of that film. So I just think you must never underestimate local interest in things, whether it is written about you or just filmed locally, or where you can find a local angle. In driving an audience, people love that element. There is an enormous pride from people about films that are made on their doorstep.
That's great, thank you very much. I want to make sure we've still got a bit of time, but I just want to make sure we get some good questions in as well. So I think we've got one over there. Do you still have that there? The microphone behind you. Oh, thank you. Got yourself.
Thank you. You were saying about culture, and I went back to university in 2006. Sociology was my thing, and Raymond Williams, of course, said that culture is a process and it should never be thought of as a thing. And also during that period, I was doing a film on a module on British national film. We had a short clip filmed in Manchester around 1960 something, so I could remember that period. It was a misty, murky, very foggy kind of atmosphere with slum clearance, and there was a shop in the middle of it, and people going in, hardly anything on the walls. I'm sitting there wallowing in nostalgia. It all finishes, and there's a guy behind me, British Asian guy, about 20 odd, who says, "It's like the third world," which suddenly jolted me into the fact that actually the past is another country, and maybe we're selling it as much as a travelogue to those people who aren't local. And people move around, so if we're telling local stories, we're not always telling them to local people. And to those local people who live locally, who weren't local then, you're actually selling them an ethnography. And that's slightly different. I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit theoretical here. But actually, we're not looking just at one audience, and sometimes it just feels, well, we're selling nostalgia to people who used to live there, who've always lived there, which is very culturally specific. I don't know if we've got any sort of thoughts on that.
Do you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I kind of think, in some ways, like local culture, local film is a process of putting people into place. You know, because we're all about, everyone's about placemaking now and doing strategies about placemaking and all that sort of stuff, but this puts people into place. And I think, you know, I mentioned Abinad Dara, the Syrian thing. What I loved about that was, you know, all of this messaging we get from Syria is what we know what it is. You know, it's what we saw with this morning on BBC. But this is actually people that live there just talking and living and engaging with us, and that's the power of it. And you know, another thing I was just thinking about, I just caught on to this Inuit kind of social media and film thing where they're doing the same thing. They're going like, we have no way of connecting us as people to the world, so actually we're going to now use culture and social media to do it. And we're telling our personal stories to camera in order to do that. And I just think there is a huge power in all of that, and it offsets, as we know from the Scottish referendum to a degree, it offsets the dominant kind of ideological messages and the dominant media messages, and it's really, really important these days to do that. We have a real role to play in all of that.
I just want to sort of agree with Sally, because in Aberdeen at the moment we're experiencing a real buzz around Sunset Song, which was filmed in several various locations. And I think Visit Scotland have even actually produced a map highlighting the areas that they can, and there's a real sort of buzz around the sort of tourism aspect. and people are really getting behind it, and we sold out a screening in sort of 90 minutes with everyone claiming that them and their sheepdog were in the film and they wanted to come and see it on the big screen. And we often will take the sort of local aspect into account when programming in, not only just films which are filmed locally, but also local filmmakers such as John Baird, who directed Filth. He grew up in Peterhead, so we screened that and it did very well. But we always have to be sort of, I guess, catering to our audience and what they want to watch, because as much as there is the local aspect, there was a certain film being released this weekend along with Sunset Song, which was filmed in the local area. It was filmed in Dunnottar Castle, and as much as we would like to shine a spotlight on everything, I don't think Victor Frankenstein is going to be as a big a hit as Sunset Song, so we do have to sort of decide what know your audience. Exactly.
My question might be a bit weird, my apologies for that, but for me it's not that obvious that local stories have to be somehow connected with geographically, let's say it this way. Well, I'm from the city. I work in a city, in a cinema where there is a lot to talk about, and actually we do screen this kind of archives about the history of our city. It was before war, it was German, now it's Polish, so there is a lot to talk about actually. But at the same time, the newest Spielberg's movie, The Bridge of Spies, it was shot in Wrocław, but Wrocław was pretending to be Berlin. So, but still, people are really interested in watching this movie because they can find some streets, you know. They normally, they know from their everyday life. But still, I mean, I'm just wondering if you can talk about, or have you experienced any local stories, not actually based on the heritage, on, you know, on history, but just very, very actual, very, you know, up to date, not at all connected with the history of the city, but just, you know, maybe something totally social, something totally...
Absolutely, I think that's a really
different.
interesting point. I suppose from my own experience, actually, I used to run a silent film festival up in Scotland, and that whole the silent film community. To me, I think local is not just geographical either. I was going to show a clip, but we don't have any time. But do check it out. It's a film called Dummy Jim, and that was made. Just came out 2 years back, and it is about. The story is basically a cyclist, James Duffy. It's a real story, who was going to cycle to Morocco, but ended up cycling to the Arctic Circle. He's profoundly deaf, and the filmmaker Matt Hulse found this. He's an artist filmmaker, and he really wanted to corral both the community of where James Duffy comes from, but also the deaf community as well. So it's a deaf actor, Samuel Dorr, and you can watch the film with a hearing impairment. There's subtitles all the way through it in a very creative way as well. It's not sort of just stuck on, and so I know that Matt had that, and I think that it has that local appeal because that's the community. Personally, if anyone else has any thoughts.
Well, I think I was staying in a hotel opposite your cinema about 2 weeks ago. It's the one I'm thinking about. And it was great actually because when I looked out my hotel window, there were people dancing in your lobby. Yeah, it's possible. yeah, and so I was really struck with this. I thought, how is that possible? That there's all these people dancing in the cinema lobby. So I thought that was really good. But I think it is a real challenge because, you know, Wrocław 2016, European Capital Culture. You know, when you go around the city, as we were taken around, the power of the heritage is so immense. You know, it's absolutely immense. And so what you're doing is reinventing it and making it contemporarily relevant. And, you know, working in Corfu right now, it's exactly the same. The power of the heritage is gigantic. So we're having to reinvent it and make it relevant and more contemporary, and that we're using culture to do that. So it's quite important. But it's very interesting that we have Flatpak here, and I'd worked with Flatpak way back in the day when it first started as a boring funder, but I was sort of working with them. And And Flatback was, for me, completely associated with Digbeth, the place of Digbeth. But things moved on from that, didn't it? And I wondered if you had any comments on that.
We'll probably have to make this the last comment. And then we're going to have to it's lunchtime.
Yeah, just to say that we are moving out of Digbeth this year completely for the first time ever. But Flatpack, I don't know how many of you know it, but it's got a really, really broad remit. But the sense of place and connecting with the different communities around Birmingham is really important. So it's very important to us, even if it's not across the breadth of the programme. One beautiful film that we showed, it was an archive film about children in Birmingham post-war that were taken on a day trip to the seaside by the NSPCC. And we screened that film and we kind of put the message out there and asked people to come along, and sort of, there was a Q&A afterwards and just talk about their experiences and their links back to that. So yeah, we may have moved out of Digbeth, but there are lots of different ways that we sort of connect with the community around Birmingham and different parts of the community. And just to echo people's comments really, that it's more than just geographical. It's about very different elements of people's experiences and histories and things that are relevant to today.
Gender, sexuality, interest as well, but the social action idea as well. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have any more time, but I've really just final comments from our panellists, and then we've got
my final, I suppose, question or challenge to the distributors in the room in relation to our film From Scotland with Love is that when our distributor, Park Circus, contacted lots of exhibitors in England, there was a kind of, oh, that's a film about Scotland, what's that got to do with us response. And I would just make the point that the country to which more Scots have emigrated over the 20th century than any other country around the world, you think Canada, North America, it's England. So you have a local audience living right next to your cinema, and it's just a question of how you understand to talk to that audience. So what I'd say about local is always about how do you configure that conversation? How do you define the conversation? It's not so much just about geographical locality.
Yeah, and I feel we've kind of, I don't, do you guys have anything else to say? Or?
No, I just echo what you've just said, Grant. I think it's about how you talk to your audience. And
that's great. Well,
know your audience.
Yeah, and some of the most wonderful films ever made, incredibly local. Fellini's film Rome, Open City. It's not a film that only appeals to people in Rome. It's a wonderful film that's resonated down the decades. So it's about how those wonderful stories, rooted in place, find an audience in their own place, but also have huge relevance to audiences outside of that place.
Absolutely, and I think we've got a lot of expertise in this room, which I'm really pleased everyone's here and contributed, and obviously to our panel as well. I feel we've kind of scratched the surface, and it's such a wide. It's more than just local people, sort of the Royston Basie idea, but it is a very wide conversation, and I hope it continues, and maybe there's a few bits and pieces that you'd be interested to talk about more. I think our panellists will be munching on their lunch boxes later on as well, so do feel free to stop and chat more. Thanks so much for coming, and thank you to Andrew, Sally, Virginia, and Grant.
Thank you.